My name is Juan Villarreal. I am a major for a teaching certificate in grades 7 through 12, and I have decided to cover reader response as my chapter. So, reader response is the idea of how we relate to literature and how we teach literature, of trying to balance our students being able to form their own opinions and judgments of a work of literature and us trying to objectively teach that literature. And this idea that students form their own opinions and judgments around relatability and how much they personally relate to the work based on their shared cultural experiences and their own personal experiences. So I chose this as my topic because it's kind of something that I myself think about a lot. This idea that, like, in the late 1960s, a group of mostly white, mostly older, mostly men sort of created this American book canon of like 25 books and like 3 plays, all by Shakespeare and Arthur Miller, that we said were important. And we have just been teaching that ever since. But culture has changed since then. The way we talk about race and class and gender and war and politics has all changed. And explaining that to students can help, but if they don't get it, that's a perfectly reasonable response. All art is subjective, and I can give all the context and subtext I want as to why so many people have decided to teach this book and why so many people love this certain book. But at the end of the day, if the author doesn't speak to them, if the students don't relate to the characters, that's not an easy issue to solve. I think of it in the same terms I think of my relationship to math. I'm bad at math, and I have had it explained by caring teachers and caring friends, and it still just never clicks with me. At best, I can grasp the content enough to pass, but it never sticks with me, and I never care for it. So this chapter is kind of about the ideas of how we teach, and how students' experiences form the way they read classic literature, and how we account for that while teaching the literature. They kind of focus a lot on this reader-centered approach, this idea that student opinions should have the last say in the value of a book, and that all that matters is how students relate to literature. But it also kind of brings up a counterpoint, which is my second point, of teachers trying to relate everything to the book we're reading to the emotion of it, and how that kind of leads students to believe the only value in literature is how it makes you feel, as opposed to any historical or cultural context. I think it also goes into how much culture can affect how students see a book. This idea of, like, can upper middle class white people understand Native Son? And how much of that is on them to understand and kind of break down their own biases to get to relating to, and how much of that is on us to guide them there. So my quotes are all kind of related to that. In the first part of the chapter, we meet a student who kind of goes off on this tangent while she's supposed to be talking about my hated The Scarlet Letter. And she just talks about her breakup with her boyfriend. And I found that interesting because it's sort of the conflict in this chapter boiled down. It's somebody relating to the book at first and then kind of spiraling into a place where the book has nothing to do with it whatsoever. And I think that's sort of like the worst case scenario of what a reader-centered approach could lead to. I'm also just going to quote students who were talking about why they didn't relate to the topic. There's one student who talks about Beloved by saying, I felt alienated by how the family interacted. I had no basis on to which relate or empathize. There's the mini story from a guy named Mark who tells us, I found little meaning in this book at all, since it did not apply to me at all. And then there's the quote that spoke to me the most, which was the 10th grade student who said something to the effect of, my teacher likes it when we get gooey and personal, the gooier the better. And I think that also kind of boils down the conflict of this chapter, this idea of, like, how much should the emotions of the students go into how much we teach the book? And should we put emotional responses over objective responses? My thought process on this, and maybe this is another reason I picked this chapter, is because I have a pretty solid thesis, which is that my thought process is that a student can have any opinion of a work of literature they want, as long as they can justify it in a meaningful context. As long as they can give a good, solid response as to why they didn't like it. I'm also somebody who likes discussion, and I have finished binge watching the first 2 seasons of How to Get Away with Murder. So my teaching idea is that I will take a book with a morally ambiguous character. For this example, I will use George of From Mice and Men, and I will split the class into 2 groups. Hopefully this would be a smaller class. I will then ask the 2 groups to make different cases. The first group will make the case that George is a bad person who killed his best friend and the man he promised to raise. By the way, spoilers for a 90-year-old book. The second group will make the case of George's defense and say that it was the only reasonable choice for him to make, that Lenny could never be happy, and that the 2 of them could never find peace. And this was the best option for him to make. The 2 groups will use quotes, and they will use the events that happened in the book, and they will make their own arguments. At the end of the project, they will both appoint one speaker who will go to the front of the class and make the argument in front of me as the judge to decide. Of course, this is just one example. We can make an argument for the complicity of Nick Carraway in the crimes of The Great Gatsby and how much of the blame is on him. Or we could do something, or we can judge the characters of The Crucible, and not Abigail Williams or the other man who was actively trying to harm them, but of the average townspeople who didn't seem to particularly care that their fellow neighbors were being arrested on suspicion of witchcraft. I think this activity would put the students in the shoes of the characters and force them to have to relate to them on a human level as people who made active choices and how those choices affected those around them in ways that are universal. We are still having conversations about complicity in the face of injustice. And while we have progressed a long ways since the early 1900s, we still generally look down on disabled people, and we still kind of see them as not equal. So this chapter has taught me something I knew I would struggle with, that being the line between emotions and facts. In English teaching, they are a lot more blurred than in other courses, and as an educator, I need my students to care about what they are reading, but we can't just always focus on the emotional and the relatable. It's taught me that I can't just accept my students having an emotional reaction to learning, because that's not all of learning. And overall, that is what I've learned from this course. I learned that teaching English is about teaching culture and cultural issues, and making sure my students relate to what I'm teaching, and making sure that what they're learning is important and relevant to them, even if they don't notice it at the time. Thank you.